Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prophesy podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Locals, all of which are in the description box. In addition to supporting me on Locals, you can also support me on Buy Me a Coffee. And let's see who's in the chat today. We got Vingel, Loella, Minoan, and Zero World. Hello, everyone. As a brief introduction to this topic, I've been asked before by people to do a video on Christian non-resistance, and something that I haven't really got around to yet, though I've had some debates and some panel discussions, which are included in the low bar. So you can check those out at your own leisure. And the question is, okay, well, I'm finally going to do it. Those people that asked me years ago, if you're still around on the channel, now is the time because I'm going to do it. So we're going to divide this into basically 4 or 5 broad categories. First one is starting with Old Testament passages, then moving on to New Testament passages, then moving on to a selection of readings of the Church Fathers, which by no means can be exhaustive. And what I'll do then is I'll have a pinned comment after this video, probably sometime tomorrow, where I create a Google Drive where I can link to files that have these quotes in more detail. It would be too extensive to read them all in this episode. So I'm only going to make some choice ones. Then I'm going to look at step 4, look at the scholarly consensus on the topic of the early Christians in war, and then give a brief overview of the history of the literature over the last century, and then wrap it up. So not to keep everybody waiting, because this will be a while, I'll get started. So we'll start with 3 Old Testament passages: Isaiah 2, 1-4, Micah 4, 1-3, and then Zechariah 9, 9-11. The word that Isaiah the son of Amoz saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. Many people shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations and rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Okay, Micah 4, 1-3. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains. It shall be exalted above the hills, and the people shall flow to it. Many nations shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion the law shall go forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And then Isaiah 2:3 and Micah 4:2 predict the coming in of the Gentiles, confirmed in Ephesians 2:19 and Acts 2:5-13. So this is the point where the Gentiles enter into covenant with God in a covenant structure. And there is no reason to assume a radical break between Isaiah 2:3 and 2:4, or between Micah 4:2 and 4:3. For the coming in of the Gentiles of the church is paired with the prophetic age of peace, but only in the church. First fruits, Romans 8:23, 1 Corinthians 15:20, 15:23, James 1:18, and Revelation 14:4. So again, we know that some of this has already come true in the church, i.e. the Gentiles coming in. We know that in the church, it's most the phrase to beat one's swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks has also occurred. And I have more to say on that later with the church fathers. Zechariah 9, 9-11. Greatly rejoice, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem. The battle bow shall be cut off. He shall speak peace to the nations, and dominion shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you also, because of the blood of your covenant, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Zechariah 9:9, which is the triumphal entry, is fulfilled in Matthew 21:5 and John 12:15. And then Zechariah 9:11, which is the Last Supper, where Christ says he gives his blood as gives the blood of the covenant in the wine for the church, is fulfilled in Matthew 26:28, Mark 14:24, and Luke 22:20. So if the verse 9 has already been fulfilled from a Christian point of view in verse 11, which, by the way, all Christians agree on, because we believe that all Christians believe that Christ did these things, then by implication, the middle must necessarily happen. If the beginning, the middle, and the end, if the beginning and the end have already happened, then by implication, the middle must have happened. There's no reason to assume otherwise. Now, if we look at the New Testament, we have Matthew 5:38 to 42. You have heard that it is said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. In the Sermon on the Mount, we see that the 5 antitheses are introduced with a variation on "ye have heard that it hath been said," which is then followed by the Greek conjunction "de," which is used as a logical contrastive to indicate that the predicate is opposed to the subject. You see in the first 2 antitheses that Christ is referring to the law of Moses with regards to the OT law on hate, Exodus 20:13, Deuteronomy 5:17, and adultery, Exodus 20:14, and Deuteronomy 5:18. The radical reversals of not quarreling or lusting have been completely accepted at face value by Christianity at large, but when it comes to the last 3 antitheses, swearing of oaths, retributive justice, and righteous anger, this method is inexplicably ignored. Have the cues changed? No. Has the conjunction changed? No. Is there any reason in the text of Matthew 5 to think that the last 3 antitheses should be watered down in contradistinction to the first 2? No. In such manner, when Christ refers to the lex talionis in Matthew 5:38, he is citing Old Testament civil law, Exodus 21:24, Leviticus 24:20, Deuteronomy 19:21. We then see the contrast. Instead of fighting back legally or militarily, Christ commands love. Key word here is the evil one, which is translated from the Greek word pronopos, which can either mean Satan, evil in general, or the evil person. Evil here is not to be understood as Satan. Christ resists Satan in Matthew 4:1-11 and Luke 4:1-13, or evil in general, since we are commanded to do so elsewhere, 1 Corinthians 10:13, Galatians 5:16, 1 Corinthians 6:18-20, Hebrews 2:18, Ephesians 6:10-18, James 1:14, James 4:17, 1 John 1:9, and Hebrews 4:15. But rather, the evil man is the one subjugating your people. Furthermore, anathema translated as resist, which can include non-military forms of resistance, such as the devil, James 4:7, false prophets, 2 Timothy 3:8, or an errant brother, Galatians 2:11, is best understood as fight in a martial context, given that the evil one is not Satan, evil in general, a false prophet, or an errant brother, but a hostile occupying force. Furthermore, given the commands elsewhere to confront metaphysical evil in the world by a process of elimination, the only form of resistance left is in military combat. In Mosaic law, one was required by law to restore a cloak to a man at night, Exodus 22:25-26, Deuteronomy 24:12-13. Verse 40 repudiates this of the above. Verse 41-42 deals with military occupation. In verse 41, we see the use of corvée labor by an occupying army, common practice from the Persians to Rome. In verse 42, we see the same formulation that we see in Luke 6:30, to give without demanding anything in return. This is unlikely to refer to almsgiving, since in both Matthew 5:42 and Luke 6:30, we are discussing enemies, someone who is suing you or occupying your nation. This also indicates that the resistance to such oppression is not martial in nature. We see here that the 5 antitheses are united in their drive to require more of a Christian than was required by the law of Moses. As such, there is no reason to indicate that any of the 5 antitheses should be read otherwise. Ergo, the Christian is called to rise above the desire to fight wars and love his enemy. John 18:36. And as an aside, I think this is actually the most powerful New Testament passage. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but now my kingdom is from another place." Christ is on trial before Pilate. In response to Pilate's query of his kingship, he responds, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I could not be delivered unto the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." The operative word here for, I've already read that. The operative word here for our consideration is fight. The Greek word is engenznato, from which we get the word agony in English. It means to fight in either a sporting contest or warfare. We have 2 reasons for not thinking this is to be understood in terms of a sporting contest. One, Christ is speaking about being liberated from captivity by a foreign leader. And then second, in the BDAG entry, the Biblical Dictionary of Ancient Greek, states that engenznato, used in the context of James 18:36, refers to fighting a war rather than a struggle in general. Thus, a more literal or accurate translation will be Christians do not fight with swords. Given that's the most literal translation of John 18:36, it becomes pretty clear what Jesus is saying and getting at, and that when it's translated in this bloodless term, fight or struggle, then we have a problem. Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against their authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. The struggle for which the armor of God is used for is not a carnal battle. The term translated as struggle, and this is really weaselly. In Ephesians 6:12 is the Greek word pale, which when translated means engaging in close hand-to-hand combat. This term originally referred to wrestling matches, but later with Aeschylus referred to military combat. Given the use of military metaphors such as sword, helmet, shield, and breastplate, the latter usage should be preferred. The word sarx, often translated as flesh, can refer to either the material flesh on your bones or the entirety of the human person under sin. Given the martial analogies already mentioned, the flesh on the bones meaning of sarx is to be preferred and is supported by the BDAG. The basic idea communicated here is that our warfare is not with physical weapons against physical people, or rather is it against principalities and powers. And what's frustrating about these translations is struggle is technically true but actually false. Because again, it's not a wrestling contest. You don't put on a sword and shield and a breastplate and a helmet to wrestle with somebody. All right, now we can look at the church fathers here. The first Christians were in agreement that the prophecies of Isaiah, Micah, and Zechariah referring to Christ and his kingdom of peace had been fulfilled in their time. They also rejected all kinds of man-killing as objectionable to the law of Christ. This consensus is supported not only by writers such as Calancis from Wheaton College, who wrote Caesar and the Lamb, Ronald J. Sider from Yale University, who wrote The Early Church on Killing, a comprehensive sourcebook on war, abortion, and capital punishment, James Davis's Lex Talionis in Early Judaism, and the exhortation of Jesus in Matthew 5:38-42, who may be accused of bias, i.e. bias in favor of, but also such sources as the Westminster Handbook to Patristic Theology, InterVarsity Press's Encyclopedia of Ancient Christianity, and Routledge's The Encyclopedia of Early Christianity, with the latter specifically making note of the ante-Nicene Fathers' views on Isaiah 2 and Micah 4. So moving into part 3, I will demonstrate the prophetic reading of the text by the church fathers and how Isaiah and Micah are viewed as being fulfilled in this maximal sense in the church. Justin the Martyr, First Apology, chapter 39. And when the spirit of prophecy speaks, is predicting things that are to come to pass, he speaks in this way. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. And that it did so come to pass, we convince you. For from Jerusalem there went out into the world men 12 in number, and these illiterate, of no ability in speaking, but by the power of God, they proclaimed to every race of men that they were sent by Christ, to teach to all the word of God. And who were formerly used to murder one another, do not only now refrain from making war upon our enemies, but also that we may not lie nor deceive our examiners, willingly die confessing Christ. Justin, the dialogue with Trypho, chapter 109. And he shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into sickles. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Irenaeus against heresies, book 34, chapter 34, paragraph 4. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and from the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he shall rebuke many people, and they shall break down their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and they shall no longer learn to fight. If therefore another law and word going forth from Jerusalem brought in such a reign of peace among the Gentiles, which received it, the word, and convinced through them many a nation of its folly, then only it appears that the prophet spake of some other person. But if the law of liberty, that is, the word of God preached by the apostles who went from Jerusalem throughout all the earth, caused such a change in the state of things that these nations did form their swords into war lances into plowshares and charge their pruning hooks from reaping the corn, that is, into instruments used for peaceful purposes, and that they are now unaccustomed to fighting, but were smitten, offer also the other cheek, then the prophets have not spoken these things of any other person, but of him who affected them. Tertullian against Marcion, book 3, chapter 21. The gospel will be this way. of the new law and of the new word in Christ, no longer in Moses, and he shall judge among the nations, even concerning their error. And these shall rebuke a large nation, that of the Jews themselves and their proselytes. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. In other words, they shall change into pursuits of moderation and peace, the dispositions of injurious minds and hostile tongues, and all kinds of evil and blasphemy. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, shall not stir up discord, neither shall they learn war any more. That is the provocation of hostility, so that you here learn that Christ is promised not as powerful in war, but pursuing peace. Origen, I think this is Epistle to Africanus 15, and many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, unto the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his way, and we will walk in it. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and a word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Against Celsus, book 5, chapter 33. And to those who inquire of us whence we come, or who is our founder, we reply that we are come agreeably to the counsels of Jesus, to cut down our hostile and insolent wordy swords into plowshares, and to convert into pruning hooks the spears formerly employed in war. For we no longer take up the sword against nation, nor do we learn war any more, having become children of peace for the sake of Jesus, who was our leader, instead of those whom our fathers followed, among whom we were strangers to the covenant, and having received a law for which we give thanks to him that rescued us from the error of our ways, saying, Our fathers honored lying idols, and there is not among them one that causeth it to reign. Hippolytus, The Refutation of All Heresies, book 6, chapter 11. All things, therefore, he says, were unbegotten, are in us potentially, not actually, as the grammatical or geometrical art. If then one receives proper instruction and teaching, and when consequently what is bitter will be altered into what is sweet, that is, the spears and the pruning hooks and the swords and the plowshares, there will not be chaff and wood begotten of fire, but mature fruit, fully formed, as I said, equal and similar to the unbegotten indefinite power. Cyprian, Treatise 12, 3 books on the testimonies against the Jews, 2nd book, Testimonies. In Isaiah, in the last times, the mountain of the Lord shall be revealed, and the house of God upon the tops of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall come upon it, and many shall walk and say, Come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and into the house of the God of Jacob, and he will tell us his way, and we will walk in it. For from Zion shall proceed the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke much people. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks, and they shall learn no more to fight. Now, the fathers I read are over a 200-year period. Now, while this particular verse is not commented on again until Eusebius with a radically different meaning, it's clear from this use of all of these fathers over a 200-year period all over the ancient Roman world that this was the universal consensus of all Christians. And the really interesting question is, what happened to this? Why did this reading go away? We'll get to that. The late Peter Connolly, author of Greece and Rome at War, one of the standard works on the topic of ancient Greek and Roman warfare, has this to say on page 220. Christianity, in contrast to Mithraism, was slow to penetrate the army. Early Christians tended to pacifism. And in any case, there was a tremendous barrier of the official military religious calendar involving the worship of pagan gods. So again, this is a secular historian. He freely admits that the Christians were primarily pacifistic. Now, as I've already mentioned before I read the Church Fathers here, I've mentioned we have the Westminster Handbook to Patristic Theology, the Encyclopedia of Ancient Christianity, and the Encyclopedia of Early Christianity. A few citations from here are in order to explain this position. So we're going to start with the Encyclopedia of Early Christianity. And these are quotes from the book. Additional New Testament teachings rooted in the Old Testament contributed further to the Christian ethical response to war. 1, non-retaliation, i.e. do not repay evil for evil, Matthew 5:39-41, Romans 12:17, 19 and 21. 1 Peter 3:9, 1 Thessalonians 5:15. 2, to overcome evil with good, Romans 12:21. And 3, Christ's kingdom is not of this world, therefore his servants do not fight, John 18:36. Very interesting that this particular encyclopedia cites the Church Fathers using exactly the same verses I used. Didn't mention Ephesians, but interesting. The early church continued in the dual view of the state. We have no evidence of Christians in the army prior to 170 AD. The entry on war in this section describes, now this is my words, describes three phases. One, total rejection of military service as far as all observable records, up to 170. And then there's a second period, which is the rejection of military service, but we have individuals enrolled in the army. Of these, some left, some were martyred for not killing their enemies of Rome, and then some were martyred for not worshiping Rome's gods. When accused of weakening the state, Christians claimed that they prayed for peace and overcame the demons who motivated men to break treaties. Therefore, they were the true defenders of the state. Most of these people in the second category were converted whilst in the army. The apostolic tradition of Hippolytus states that if you join the army, you'll be kicked out of the church. That's also mentioned in these encyclopedias. Constantine tolerated Christians and became their benefactor in this new era. Ambrose and Augustine formulated a just war tradition. Now back to direct quotes from the Encyclopedia of Early Ancient Christianity, Volume 3. The Christians of the first 3 centuries wanted to apply the evangelical idea of peace to their lives and held the faith to be irreconcilable with any type of violence or killing. Christians justified their refusal to serve in the military on 2 fundamental reasons. First, the military way of life led almost necessarily to committing acts of violence and killing. Second, enlistment and criteria, other moments in their way of life required acts of pagan worship. Clement of Alexandria insists that Christians must be pacifists and emphasizes the anti-pedagogical function of military expenses. After the conversion of Constantine, the relation between the church and the state began to change. Christians became involved and were made jointly responsible in the management of public order. They elaborated the theory of just war, scare quotes in the book, I didn't put them there, placed it under the moral law. Christians benefited from the Pax Romana and were aware that this was acquired by war, yet they preferred to testify to their faith by opposing every form of violence. They condemned the cruelties and slaughter connected to military service, and in extreme cases, even the necessity of war. They affirmed that care for peace and justice should animate everyone, even the soldier. So one might argue that this closing statement is somewhat contradictory. There's 2 ways you can view this. One, the entire article goes all the way up to the 7th century, which does include the Constantine and the changes made. So one could argue that it's combining the 2 different views. That's one way the other way you could read this is that while the Christians had this dual view of the state, that it was lawful for the state to fight wars so that the Roman Empire could protect the civil peace, but Christians weren't supposed to be a part of it. Either one, I think, is a sensible reading of this final paragraph of that section, in which case there's no essential contradiction. Lastly, we have the Westminster Handbook to Patristic Theology. Most Christian writings of the earliest period, again, direct quotes, of the earliest period are remarkably pacifistic and advocate communities to conform political authorities peacefully. I would argue entirely pacifistic, but I mean, given that Moguchkin is Orthodox and Westminster is Presbyterian, that's quite the concession. InterVarsity Press and Routledge are secular, so they have no dog in this fight or horse in the race. This work, okay, my statement, lists Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Cyprian, and Lactantius as vocal opponents to war. Okay, direct quote again. It was easy enough for theorists to argue a radical pacifist position before the church had responsibility for being the moral guidance of the state. But how could Christianity now claim to guide a new political order without readiness to bless war? Would it not be the case, as Celsus had once mockingly claimed in the 2nd century, that if there ever was a Christian emperor, he would have to be hopelessly pacifist, and thus leave Rome to be ravaged by its enemies? Well, this is my response to Moguchkin, who's Orthodox, by Dostoevsky, who's Orthodox, from the Grand Inquisitor. In accepting the kingdom of the world in Caesar's purple, one would have founded a universal kingdom and secured mankind eternal peace. And who could rule mankind better than those who have possessed themselves of men's conscience, hold in their hands man's daily bread? Having accepted Caesar's glaive in purple, we had, of course, but to deny thee, to henceforth follow him alone. So I would ask Moguchkin, how have they not done what Dostoevsky warned? And it's a facetious question they have. Now, for the final and I think 5th part, we'll have a brief overview of the relevant literature in the just war pacifist debate. One is, beginning this in 1905, is Adolf Harnack's Milita Christi and Cecil John Cadeau's Early Christian Attitude to War, 1905 and 1919, respectively. Both of these were some of the earliest accounts of a sort of universal scholarly attempt at what was the Christian attitude towards war before Constantine, both of whom assumed a literal reading of what these people were saying. We see the next iteration of this with John Howard Yoder's Politics of Jesus, 1972, which seems to then provoke a response. We have John Helgeland, who's a Catholic, Christians in the Roman Army from Marcus Aurelius to Constantine, 1979, Christians in the Roman Army, 1980, Christians in the military, the early experience with Robert John DeLay, 1985. I will say that John Helgeland is a thoroughly disagreeable character and a really good example of his disagreeableness in style and tone is his review of Milita Christi, the Christian religion in the military in the first 3 centuries by Adolf Harnack. He writes, repulsed by World War I, Cadeau produced his work in 1919, which is now reprinted. More than Harnack, Cadeau is responsible for the fiction of the early church until the time of Constantine was pacifist, and on those grounds prohibited Christians from enlisting in the Roman army. After the reign of Constantine, the church sold out, as it were, to the empire for the sake of power. I mean, this is just clearly delusional. One, that's exactly what Dostoevsky says. Two, granted, this was 1985, 82 rather, but the scholarly consensus now agrees that the church was universally pacifistic. So the question is, what motivated Helgeland to fudge it, right? A lot of these people, I think, are motivated by base motives because we know they're wrong. Not only do we know they're wrong, the scholarly consensus has moved beyond their sand-blowing exercise. And I'll get more into that a little bit later. So let's continue with this. We have Paul Ramsey, his 1988, let's write this here, 1988, Speak Up for Just War or Pacifism, a critique of the United Methodist Bishop's letter in defense of creation. The Virtue of War by Alexander Webster and Deborah Cole, 2007. And then Peter J. Lightheart's Defending Constantine, 2010. This is a position advocated by Helgeland, which is then picked up by Lightheart, which is the idea that the early church was divided and confused about what its view on war was, some for, some against. And, Tertullian and Origen were vocal and wrote a lot, so they tend to dominate the discussion. And that's a position that Peter J. Lightheart picks up. Again, scholarly consensus shows, and again, Moguchkin's orthodox, that's not the case. So the question is, either people like Helgeland, Ramsey, and Lightheart were slipshod and incompetent, or they were motivated by base motives. I've been in some exchange with Lightheart. I don't think he's motivated by obviously base motives. I think some of the others are. Because again, the facts are just not there. If you read the ancient church fathers prior to Constantine, there's not one who advocates war. We also, back to this debate that's going on that begins in the 70s, we have Ronald Baton's Christian Attitudes Towards War and Peace, a Historical Survey and Critical Reevaluation, 1979. We have Stanley Hauerwas, who contributed Should War Be Eliminated? Philosophical and Theological Investigations, 1984. Against the Nations, War and Survival in Liberal Society, 1985. War and the American Difference, Theological Reflections on Violence and National Identity, 2011. And I've already mentioned Calancis, Sider, and Davis. So, broadly speaking, we can say that there was an initial historical consensus at the beginning of the 20th century that the early Christians were pacifistic. In fact, this actually predates the 20th century. This is an attitude even echoed by Gibbon in Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then beginning in the 70s, when there's a debate that begins between the pacifist sect, a scholarly interpretation, and the just war scholarly interpretation of these early periods. And then now we've come into the era of Calancis and Sider, and then the scholarly consensus from the above mentioned encyclopedias, going back to where it started. So I think a lot of this just war nonsense was part of the Cold War, because it's the 80s, the 70s, and the 80s. There's a strong push to keep Americans or whatever in the fight or something. And while it continues beyond, the second impetus was the War on Terror. Notice the years for the last two, 2007 and 2010. So clearly there's pressure to do this. Now then the question is, why is all this important, especially the first 300 years? Well, let's start with the first one, right? if we want to understand any historical political movement, we need to understand in what conditions it developed. What were the conditions under which it developed? Okay, and then the second thing we need to understand is what did they mean when they said certain things. So how did the church fathers at that time read Micah and Isaiah? Well, I showed you. How did they read Matthew 5? How did they read all this? How did they behave? What did the pagans think of this? What were their criticisms? I mean, the Romans criticized the Jews for being too violent, the Sicarii and the assassin type Jews. They claimed quite the opposite for the Christians. If we read Roman sources and Christians engaging with Romans. And the other thing is there's a more broader historical narrative amongst Christians that Constantine, so this begins in the Reformation, but it's more an extension of the Radical Reformation, is that with Constantine, the Christian church took a really wrong turn. So we could say that the Orthodox and the Catholics, as well as what I'll call the magisterial Protestants, Anglicans, Lutherans, and Reformed, all basically believe that Constantine is an authentic continuation of the Christian attitude towards the state in war. There's nothing to see here, no changes here. And then there's the position that, hold on, no, he took a wrong turn. And that's a position that was often held by the Radical Reformation. And of course, John Howard Yoder was a Mennonite. I think Hauerwas was a Methodist. I don't remember what Baton was. Harnack and Cadeau were not really Christians per se. They were anti-war pacifists. So, but they were, I think, speaking to a Christian audience, since especially leading up to and after World War I, most of these nations would have said they're quote Christian nations, unquote. And so then the question is, why is this important? Well, because it's at the beginning of Christianity, right? The assumption is with religion, and I would argue philosophy as well, the closer you are to the source, the closer you are to the correct understanding. That's not to mean that at the very beginning, all the possible permutations of a religion were sorted out, because there are certain problems that they hadn't yet confronted. For example, nobody in the first century knew what to do with a telephone or a computer. Nonetheless, there are things that don't change. Our relationship to the state, our relationship in war to other people, those don't change. So that's a sort of insight that will be fixed over all time and all places. And the issue then is, well, why do we have to invent this completely fraudulent idea of a divided, uncertain position on the church? Because if the true, consistent position was made clear, it would be self-evidently obvious that the early church was not in favor of any sort of just war, let alone crusades, which produces a very large problem. Two problems. One problem is, whatever your branch of Christianity you adhere to, you have to view yourself as in some sense consistent of coming through this bottleneck in the first couple centuries, because that's where all the Christians come from. Even if you don't make an implicitly historical argument. But then there are those that do. So the Catholics and the Orthodox on the one hand, and then the Anglicans and the Reformed and the Lutherans on the other, all make various claims of historic continuity. Oh yeah, we're completely continuous with the true strain of Christianity and the Gospels handed down the ages. Well, on this issue, and I think I can, and as I continue other episodes in Like Nature, other issues, it's not the case. Not at all. And what this really amounts to is two things, right? One is most Protestants don't read the Church Fathers. It's really more of an Anglican thing. A lot of the earliest English translations were Anglican and or Methodist. So, for example, Jonathan Wesley, in reading the Greek Fathers of the East, in English, I think you could probably read the Greek, got the idea of free will and challenged the Reformed churches in North America. And then you've also got, of course, the Catholics and the Orthodox who that's really their thing. And it just shows that they're sitting on it. Either they know what's there and they're actively suppressing it, or it's a bluff. It's like, well, trust us, we've read it. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But they haven't. Because as soon as you go through the materials, it's not there. As another segue, this is why Logos and I are going through the Church Fathers. This is a very important subject since, something like 2 billion people on this planet claim to be Christians. Well, what does Christianity actually teach? What is it? How did it start? Right? That's the question we're not allowed to ask. How did it start? So going back to the question, you know what's important if you can't talk about it. Well, you can't talk about how Christianity started. And so this is a typological, I'm looking at a single type, Christianity and war, of this question. Logos and I are just going through the works sequentially. So we're not going to necessarily have any unique typological focus. We'll deal with issues as they arise. And the other thing that you'll see is that many modern day Christian churches, whether they explicitly state continuity with the historical origins of the church, like say Catholics, Anglicans, and Orthodox, or an implicitly state it, well, we're the true New Testament church, and they must have been like us. It just doesn't hold water. And the other thing then is, how did Christianity get such a black eye? We live in a post-Christian world and a post-Christian society, and most people have a generally dim view of the church and Christianity. A lot of this, of course, begins in the First World War, when all of these quote-unquote Christian nations go to war and blow each other hell and back. That led to the rise of communism, fascism, and Nazism, which, of course, was a reaction in some sense to this bloody conflict, instigated and supported in part, but not entirely, by the churches of these respective countries. And so what this does is it creates a blowback effect where it has the opposite effect of what they wanted, not only in the sense of losing military conflicts. We lost the war on terror pretty bad in Afghanistan, and yet going back to 2007, 2010, a lot of these just war books were written in order to prop up the war on terror, a complete catastrophe. And so one could argue that the other reason to challenge this reading of history and reading of Christian thought is that it challenges these destructive foreign adventures of the United States. I mean, almost nobody in our circle thinks the war on terror was a good idea. It wasn't. But there was a point in time when the just war core was in full press. It was out in strength in order to push for this war. The war in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was a total failure, which, by the way, never met any of the just war criteria in the first place, but that's neither here nor there. And I think ultimately the really interesting part for people, especially that are not directly involved in this debate, is that, again, the Westbrook's Handbook to Patristic Theology, InterVarsity Press's Encyclopedia of Ancient Christianity, and Routledge's The Encyclopedia of Early Christianity all are in agreement on this. That's incredible. Especially given that there was this dog and pony show argument lasting from the 70s to 2010, which, I mean, none of these people are mentioned in the encyclopedia. They don't mention Lightheart. They don't mention Ramsey. They don't mention Helgeland and their works, because their works are all bunk. They all fail to measure up against the actual facts. The actual facts of the early church fathers prior to Constantine took a radically literal reading of Jesus' teachings in Matthew 5. And the historical record is clear on this. It's always been clear. And again, probably sometime tomorrow, I'll create a pinned comment with a link to a Google Drives folder that will allow anybody who's interested to actually read a large list, larger than I could read tonight because it would take too long. And I would recommend, since they're free online, you don't have to pay anybody, Harnack's Mill to Christie and Cadow's Early Christian Attitude to War. These are free. If you have a little bit of money to spend and you're still interested in the subject, I would highly recommend Calancis's and Sider's work, which I'll scroll up here for. Caesar and the Lamb, and the early church on killing, a comprehensive source book on war, abortion, and capital punishment. Now, to wrap this all up, let's just reiterate what I've already said. Isaiah 2, 1-4, Micah 4, 1-3, and Zechariah 9, 9-11 all predict that Christ would bring in the Gentiles in an age of peace. Okay, that's number one. Matthew 5, 38-42 clearly teaches, based on the principle of the antitheses, that the Christian should turn the other cheek against the enemy and not fight in the sort of, again, the context here is that the Jews were engaging in their Sicarii, their assassin activities, which ultimately led to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. One theory is that Judas Iscariot was a Sicarii, and he was mad that Jesus wasn't going to lead a revolt against the Romans. So it's a plausible theory, but one that I don't think has been confirmed. John 18:36 is the clearest. Christians don't fight with swords. Literal interpretation. Ephesians 6:12 is also pretty explicit. We don't fight in hand-to-hand combat is the literal translation. So the New Testament is clear. And there are other passages, but for the sake of brevity, I wanted to limit it to that. We have a universal reading of the prophetic passages of Isaiah and Micah as being interpreted in this way by all the early Christians up until Eusebius, which of course is the point of change, which again is self-evident confirmation. We could have done the same with Matthew chapter 5, again, turning of the cheek. They have a similar reading as well. And that will be included in some of the more broader texts that I link to tomorrow. And then also, the scholarly consensus is that they were all pacifists. The historical debate was that early 20th century, they were pacifist. Beginning in the 70s, there's this debate between the pacifist interpretation and the non-pacifist interpretation. And then the final, in the literary arguments, the final response and final volley has come from the pacifist side, which no one's answered. No one's formally answered Calancis or Cider. And the scholarly consensus is that the early church before Constantine was pacifistic, so that the side that was vested in a confused and divided church position in the first centuries has been thoroughly refuted and basically doesn't seem to have any standing. And the question is, why did they do that? Well, given the dates, the late 70s, early 80s, and the aughts, this is just probably, war money behind it or something. You got the Cold War you got to fight, you got terrorism you got to fight, so, there you go. A lot of this is just, and again, the facts were always the facts. They haven't changed. The question is, why was it that we have this insurgency, if you will, of clearly fraudulent scholars? And I think it's because of war pressure, either for money or prestige or whatever, which had the disastrous consequence of pushing America into the Middle East, right? The last one from the 80s, right before the Persian Gulf War, 1991. And then perpetuating the wars in the Middle East, 2007 and 10. So the legacy of this school is a complete CF in the Middle East, which we're still reeling from all over the world. Not a great legacy. So that's the end of the show today. I know that was a lot for everybody. Hopefully that was informative. Let's see who's in the chat. JLM, hello. Jacob J. Vingel, if I ever tell about an argument I'm having on YouTube, hit me on the back of the head and I'll tell you to stop. All right. Let's see what else we got here. But no, when my cat accidentally timed out a chatter on Saturday on Todd's stream, do I need to call the cat? No, you don't. Minoan, I can't reconcile the passages with the reality of not defending oneself means getting wiped out. Well, I mean, the Confederates got wiped out. The Amish didn't. And that's one example. Let's see. Record deepness at Minoan. The early Christians survived. The Second Temple was destroyed. Yes. Record deepness. Who really got wiped out? I have to get going, but just wanted to say thanks for another informative episode, Todd. You're welcome. I will say this though, Minoan. This is a very technical, specific intra-Christian debate question, and I brought this up, one, because people had asked me to do it, and I hadn't done it yet. Two, in order to give a more positive account of what I'm for. Many people are like, well, I know what I'm against. I'm against this and that and the other thing. But what are you for? And then the question is there an intuitive, non-theological reason to think this way? And there is. Well, it's still theological, and it's called ahimsa. It's one of the first of the 5 yamas of Vedic thought, the idea of do no harm. And so I do plan on doing a video in the future showing how Vedic thought, classical Greek thought, and Christian thought are all converging on a certain principle. And that principle is the principle of do no harm. And so I'll have to do a little more homework on the sort of Vedic end of this. But that will hopefully provide a more rationalistic understanding of why one might have a more specific theological reading of this. And then second of all, as I said, Christianity purports to have something around 2 to 3 billion adherents globally. I think it's 2. Well, what is Christianity? What does it really teach? That's an important question. And then the question is, who are closer to what Christianity really teaches? Because again, it's a lot of times Christians' own behavior that leads to the blowback that they receive. And so, yeah, everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for tuning in. This is Todd Lewis from the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.